And please just, I'm going to, basically jump in if I say something that is confusing or whatever. I'm not entirely positive where to best meet the audience. So if I say something that I think is obvious that you don't, let me know, or vice versa. If it's obvious to you and I don't need to belabor it, let me know so I can use it, make the best use of it. So I want to just introduce myself briefly. I, as the introduction said, have recently joined TRC. Previously worked at Portland General Electric. I'll just give like a kind of brief overview of who I am and how I got here. So, I started out my career. I actually have a PhD. I studied climate science at the University of Colorado and then at the University of Oregon. And at the time, it seemed like where we are right now today is, if we look back about 5 years, there's really been this focus on solutions and solutions to the climate crisis and energy transition among those. And when I started my graduate work, it seemed like we were on the cusp of that, but it turned out that I was ahead of my time, or perhaps more accurately, the world was not moving as rapidly as it should have. And one thing I learned through that graduate work is that I'm a solution-oriented person, so I didn't want to just study the problem. I felt like the problem was well enough understood, and we should be able to, to act on it. So, so I was impatient with that. What I did was kind of pivot my skill set. So I had done a lot of stuff with software technology and programming stuff. So I basically made a career of that. As I went through that, I then, rose up and became a manager and a senior manager in software development and delivery organizations. And I got really focused on how to do that work better. And so then I kind of caught the wave of the agile software movement, and I was able to use agile methods really successfully in my own work as a manager. That led me to helping others to do that. So then I spent about 11 years running my own consulting practice where I helped different companies with agile transformation, or using agile operating methods to do more of what was valuable for them. And one of those companies, among many, was Portland General Electric, where I spent some time and had really a lot of fun. So when it came to be that sort of a thing that I thought was going to happen way back at the beginning of my career was actually happening, then this is a natural place and time for me to pivot again and really to focus on utilities. And so that's what I've been doing most recently. And I've joined TRC companies, and TRC is a big, it's a pretty big company. We've got about 7,000 people. It's mostly engineering, so a lot of different vertical areas, infrastructure, environmental, but the main one is power. So we're definitely focused more than 50% on the electric utilities and energy. And then within that, TRC has recognized that the digital aspect of utilities is really an essential component of what is happening, what needs to happen. So TRC is building up through organically and through acquisition a digital practice, which we call intelligent grid solutions. So starting from nothing in about 2019, we're about 10% of the company now. So that's exciting, and that's where I sit. So for our utility customers, these are some of the capabilities that we offer. And we are very much a trusted advisor model. So we organize our practices around the different systems that utilities own and operate. We are not connected to any particular system provider. So for example, in geospatial is one of our biggest practice areas. Like some utilities use Esri, some utilities use Small World, some utilities use other things. We work with all of those technologies, whatever the utility is using or needs to use or wants to use. That's what we support and go after. So I think it's an important place to be because, as we'll discuss as we get into this, what utilities, the road to virtual power plants, like it or not, goes through utilities. You just can't go it alone and create the kind of value or impact that you would want to create or would need to create to realize that vision. So from my point of view, with my experience and background, it makes sense to work to help the utilities create that pathway, because I think that's where the difference between, a relatively small market and a very much bigger, more dynamic, more impactful market is how utilities connect with this opportunity, the virtual power plant opportunity. So we've all, I know we've had some previous discussions. I think I'm the 12th one, and I know there was one earlier on where y'all talked around the Brattle Group report, which came out in May, I think it was. And then more recently, building on that, was this liftoff report from the Department of Energy Loan Program Office, the virtual power plants commercial liftoff. Definitely built heavily on the Brattle Group work. And then this other thing just came out yesterday. And so this is Vermont, Green Mountain Power is a very forward, progressive utility, investor-owned utility in Vermont, relatively small. I think they have about 270,000 customers. But this is really significant because what they're doing is they're saying, instead of buying more poles and wires and transformers, the best place for us to invest is in distributed energy resources. Like we can reach our mission by investing in distributed energy resources, and that is a really significant shift. I don't know how that's going to play out, or whether their regulator will be receptive or not to that message, and what will end up happening, and how hard it will be or easy for them to meet their goals. But that is a hugely significant change, because it's really what, for virtual power plants to realize their potential, that's exactly what has to happen. Is utilities and their regulators at the scale of their entire service territory and everything they do need to say, we can decide between the traditional types of investment that we have made to the distribution system, and an alternate view where we actually reposition and reframe that and invest in distributed energy resources and demand flexibility. So that's super exciting. What I want to talk about is these things. So I really want to just give a little bit of orientation on what I think some of the highlights of what we're going to see in the near future. When I say near future, I think maybe the next 5 years. Just a brief history of the utility sort of landscape and how things got the way they are. Talk about what I think we're all interested in here is this energy transition, and what our shared challenges. We try to take that path that goes through working with utilities. I want to talk about the atomic unit of value here is grid services. So what are some of those grid services? Just go down a level into that. Talk about how utilities are organized on the inside and what that means to you, and then give some ideas for how we might achieve scale as we progress. So predicting the future, always difficult, but I think when you see certain things are like right on the cusp, you can sort of make safer bets. So for example, like 7 years ago, it was not 5 or 7 years ago, it was not completely clear how feasible or when utility scale storage would be like kind of reach the mainstream, but it has definitely happened. And so if we look at this, I see some of the things that we'll see is like, while there's still a lot of non-renewable generation, and there's even some, projects in the works that people worry about, China's still building coal-fired power plants and like, basically all of the new generation that's being, put on the drawing board, brought into service, used to its maximum capacity, is becoming renewable. So, and people are starting to reach their renewable goals in certain areas faster than they plan to, which is huge. But I think what we'll see is as the pathway becomes clearer, and as sort of the warning signs of not acting from a climate standpoint become clearer, I think we'll see a lot of different actors pressuring for renewable energy targets to be met sooner because it's technically feasible, it's economically feasible, so why not move it up? So I think even where you see utilities that have like a goal of like carbon free by 2045 or 2050, I think you'll see that being moved up. Even if utilities are not, if their regulators are not pushing for that, they're receiving so much pressure from like their corporate customers, for example, that there's just a lot of reasons why that trend toward renewable deployment is going to accelerate. And similarly, we have kind of in the U.S. at least, we have this Inflation Reduction Act kind of locked in the growth of solar. So what we see is like a steady, not always a hockey stick, but a very like steady progress of solar projects make sense to individual homeowners, and they're putting solar on their roof, and it takes time, but it's happening very steadily and probably at an increasing rate. The battery market is going to be storage. Battery storage is going to be huge. There'll probably be other kinds of storage, but everything's really driven by all that R&D in the electric vehicle space, driving the cost down, and then we're going to see products coming online. Once batteries are being recycled, there's going to be a lot of sort of cheap second life batteries flooding the market. There'll be a lot of new products that use those. And then, make no mistake, but electric vehicles are going to be the biggest source, the biggest distributed energy resource. So what I think will happen there is that we'll have, today we're sort of experimenting with managed charging, but if you think about like vehicle to home, you can, you don't necessarily need like an interconnection to have a bidirectional charger if it's only powering your home. So basically you can turn your car into a backup battery for your home. And once you do that, that gives you a huge amount of leverage to affect your load. You might not be able to export energy to the grid, but you can turn the amount of energy that you're consuming at your home all the way off for an extended period of time. So today where we do, demand response programs and they barely register, it's going with that storage online behind the meter, it's going to be a lot easier to have like a really huge impact, particularly if there's a strong, economic incentive to do that. And then fleet electrification is going to be very big. So once the total cost of ownership, becomes viable, then, fleet operators are sort of dispassionate economic actors. They'll just switch over, and so they'll just start buying electric vehicles everywhere. So this is what I predict, and I only say this not because it's my main topic, but it's because it's a background for what I'm going to tell you next. So I'm not sure how much people are aware of the history of the utility industry. Anybody kind of give me feedback on that? Are you all pretty up on this? Has anybody ever read this book?
I think it varies, but a lot of us have read it.
You have, some of people have. So just really briefly, like I have, so in my work, doing transformation consulting with different big Fortune 500 companies and companies of all sizes. I had a colleague who would say things are the way they are because they got that way. So it's the way that the way that utilities are in the United States is not like a logical consequence of like the way electricity works or anything like that. It's really a function of the way that the industry grew in a particular like political context, right? So if you go back to say like 1900 or so, when electrification was just starting, a lot of companies got their start as like Portland General Electric, where I used to work, for example, got its start as a streetcar company. So basically there would be, the streetcar company would have its own generation, the lighting company would have its own generation, and the streetcars would run during the day and then they'd turn off the generation. The lighting would run at night and then they'd turn off the generation. And so both of those had like a business model problem, which is you had a lot of capital invested that was not productive all the time. If you look at it in hindsight, it's kind of obvious. And this was also the era of trust busting, the Teddy Roosevelt administration. And so as the electricity grew up, there was kind of this business proposition of like, hey, street light company and electric light company, let's merge together, and then we can run our generation more centralized generation at a larger scale. We have economies of scale. It's more efficient because we use it all day long. And when motor loads started to come on, when people started to replace steam and direct like hydro power for mills with electricity, then that was like the final main element, a game changer. So in that context, the utilities basically made a deal. At that point, like trust busting was well entrenched, and nobody wanted to see electricity trusts growing up. So they made a deal to be a regulated monopoly. They said, look, we're a natural monopoly. Like it doesn't make sense to have 15 different sets of electric wires running through every neighborhood. And we have this, these economies of scale, but we want to run, we will be obedient to the government, society's needs, and you can regulate us. In exchange, we're going to get a guaranteed rate of return on the capital that we need to invest. So that was sort of the way that the deal was made. And at the time, nobody wanted a big like national utility. So that's how we got a landscape where we have 200 investor. Well, it used to be 200, and that's more like 160, 170 investor-owned utilities. But that's not a very centralized. If economies of scale are real, that's not a very centralized place to have gotten to, right? Over 120 years, and that's because at the time that people just didn't want it that way. So as I was like looking at this presentation, one of the things that I noticed was kind of this like, and we've come up a couple more times, like this sort of 70-30 rule. Like about where we are today is about 70% of our 70% of electric customers in the U.S., which is all of us, are getting electricity from an investor-owned utility, one of those 168 or whatever there are, and then everybody else is served by some kind of co-op or municipal electric provider, and there's probably almost 450, 500 of those. So there's kind of that, and then most of our generation is centralized. But if you think about going back to that place where the electric light company had its own generating source, the streetcar company had its own generating source, et cetera, or the factory had its own generating source. The pendulum's kind of swinging back with the change in technology and the advent of renewables and storage and stuff like that. So that's really what's happening. That Green Mountain Power example is that the pendulum is beginning to swing back a little bit, and that's what we're all connected with virtual power plants. So we have this, all of us here, I think, on this call have kind of a shared challenge, which is that there is this large number of electric utilities, primarily the investor-owned ones are like the dominant, those are the biggest ones, are the ones that kind of move the market, in, at least in a kind of momentum sense. And they all have their individual regulators. There's not 160 regulators, but there's a lot of regulators. Every state has its own regulatory regime. So all the regulators kind of copy each other. All the utilities like to learn from each other, which is a strength because, people share what they're doing, and, there's not really competition like state to state. So you can, most utilities are happy to share with other utilities what they're doing in their programs and what they've learned. And but the question is, if people are all going in a certain direction at a certain pace, like our shared challenge is that we need the energy transition to go faster. And in order for that to happen, there's this complex transformation that needs to take place, where multiple entities on the government side, on the utility side, in the private startup side of things, all need to change together and decide what to do and where to go. And so that's really what we're trying to figure out together, is how can we get this large industry that's really made up of a large number of small similar pieces to all move faster in a shared direction that we all agree on. And as we do that, I think it's important to look at the economics and really what it is that distributed energy resources can provide to the utility. So there's different power services, or there's different grid services that we can talk about. And we can break those down into services that are just energy, like energy has to be in demand, supply and demand have to be in balance all the time. The energy kind of travels wherever it needs to go. So it doesn't matter whether you generate your energy here or on the next block, or 200 miles away or further. Energy is energy as long as the pathways to get it there are available. So and there's transmission losses, there's all kinds of things, but the most virtual power plant type things today operate in that realm in the orange. They're basically providing energy. And so if you look at and we'll talk about ISOs in a second, if you look at the market, so again, we get to like the 70-30 rule keeps coming up. If you look at like some places where the markets are well established for these services, about 70% of the value, by the things that I've looked at, goes to the generation capacity, day ahead energy, goes to those bulk power services. However, that is also because the purple ones aren't really operating very effectively yet. So I don't think it's 70% of all the value that can be or will be. It's just 70% of the value that's available for people to tap into right now. So part of that shared challenge is, how do we get these grid operations type services to be growing, right? Like we're talking about like market transformation and enlarging the pie and creating the true opportunity. Yes, we want to be continuing to provide energy because that's, it's a straight pathway. It's easier to do. It's very valuable. But these other things are also potentially, especially in some niches, a lot more valuable than they are today. So there's a lot of market opportunity there. So here's another 70-30. Like I say, this just kind of keeps coming up. So ISOs or RTOs, so are these regional entities that manage that energy, right? So what has emerged over time, and this is actually like a, the way that the utility industry has historically progressed, is that this is an economic idea which has gradually grown, and so there's about 70% of electricity customers are within an ISO or RTO, and the rest of them, these blank spots, these tan spots, those utilities, they're just not in an organized market. It doesn't mean that they're not trading, and doesn't mean that there isn't some kind of economic exchange going on. It's just not part of a organized, large, transparent market. It's a lot of like bilateral, you think of like the old fashioned commodities trader on the phone with like 3 different phones on his desk, and chain smoking and talking to all these people in other different rooms like that around. That's kind of the what's going on in these beige areas. But this is important because everybody may have heard of the FERC order 2222. So for better or for worse, the way things tend to progress in the utility industry is that eventually there'll be kind of a regulatory edict from the feds or from a large number of individual state regulators, and then gradually the utilities follow that. So what 2222 says is that basically in these bright colored areas, the utilities need to open up their distribution systems so that virtual power plant type providers can put energy into the system, that they can participate in the market, that they're not shut out simply because they are sited on the distribution system. So that's a big opportunity, and but it's taking a long time. Like the rules and like enacting the rules and deciding how we're going to act the rules, is progresses very slowly, but it's in process. So the thing then to look at when we go back to those different grid services is kind of go down a level functionally within the utility. So the utility isn't just this one big entity where everybody's, hey, I'm talking to, Sally Smith at the utility, so I'm talking to the utility, right? Like everybody who's in the virtual power plant business, if they have the wherewithal and the resources, they've got some kind of utility liaison person or utility partnerships person, and it really matters, depending on what you're trying to do, who you're talking to inside that utility, because there are a lot of silos in the utility, and some of those are just like the silos that are traditional in large organizations, large kind of maybe established, some would say bureaucratic organizations. But there's also like these silos that are like literally enshrined in law that sort of further that division. So if you're talking to Sally Smith at utility A, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody at utility A is on board with what you're doing and totally understands the potential that you communicated to Sally Smith and is right there with you. You could just be talking to somebody in one of these boxes, and nobody in the other boxes has any idea of what you're doing or what you're talking about. They might not be bought into it in any way, and it might not be, therefore, you might be missing the boat on feasibility or receptiveness or any other thing that could kind of sink you as you're trying to progress your virtual power plant initiative. So just kind of going into these one by one a little bit. Most people who are working with utilities on virtual power plants, we said that those big kind of bulk energy is the big thing, it's typically going to be, if you're like transacting bulk energy, it's going to be, usually through the customer programs and or the merchant part of the organization. So these are people that trade bulk energy, and then customer programs are the people that are authorized to work with their customers to create things like efficiency programs and demand response programs, and the types of things that Green Mountain Power is doing started out as pilot customer programs, and then they've grown up to a much bigger potentially thing, but that's how they start. And then most utilities also have, because of all these changes that are kind of on the horizon, have a grid modernization entity, like a permanent sort of set of people that are charged with making the kind of clean energy digital transition. So like in my role, we very often work with the grid modernization folks. But there's also grid operations, which is distinct from power operations. So if we go back to that earlier diagram with the bulk services and the grid services, people that are actually switching the wires down which power flows and monitoring when outages occur, and trying to reroute things and to avoid, if a car hits a pole, to avoid like a transformer overload on another circuit. That's grid operations, and much less frequent that grid operations connected to virtual power plants. And then over on the right, we have the ISO and the RTO. So again, those like in about 70% of the time, that the way that the sort of power flows around is really governed by a market. So it's really controlled at a much higher level. Like in the Texas, for example, or in California, the ISO is really managing that at the whole state level. And then the last thing is the balancing authority. And so that's where it's a little bit, it's not, a balancing authority is basically like keeping the energy imbalance between different parts of the grid at the transmission level. And there isn't like, there's usually, sometimes there's like one balancing authority at the ISO level, but in most of that picture, that map that we looked at, it's a little bit smaller than that. So there's like we go back to that. I don't know how I could get up there. How do I go backwards in this thing? There. We go back to this map. So like in the Western Interconnect, I think there's like 30 some balancing authorities. In the Eastern Interconnect, there's 30 some balancing authorities. So it's not, there's not like 200 balancing authorities, but there's not 15 either. It's kind of somewhere in between. But the point is that these boxes, sometimes like a couple of them work together, but seldom do they all work together as one giant unit automatically. Like if you're trying to bring about a change that enhances that pie, that creates more potential value, one of the challenges is working within the utility to work across these silos to make change. And that's really, again, that's what the type of work that I do with TRC is, in large part trying to figure that out. So there's another thing that almost everybody who works in this space is familiar with, is that the complaint is basically that we're not reaching scale. Like virtual power plants are just, all these initiatives are stuck in these demonstrations and pilots that just go on forever. And I've seen that. I've been part of that. I experienced that. I think I don't have a super easy like alternative solution. I think that's just the way things are going to go. So it's just a question of like, how do you make this work? But I think it's challenging because like this is how like renewables have scaled up. This is how utility scale storage has scaled up. So it works. You do technical demonstration, you prove something out, you scale it up to the next order of magnitude with a pilot, and then you can roll it out at the whole utility scale. That works when you're dealing with utility-owned technology. When you get over into the space where like customers and third parties working with customers are involved, and there needs to be like, a lot of that is relatively foreign territory for utilities. So that's what makes it more challenging. It's not that the fundamental model doesn't work. It's just like the how to get it done, basically, is the challenging part. I just want to pause for a second. So is this making sense to folks? I don't want to, I heard about halfway through. I don't want to, I can still adjust.
Clinton, Clinton has a question.
Yeah, I have a quick question, Adam. So you were talking earlier about how a lot of these investor-owned utilities talk to each other and learn from one another across the country.
Yep.
On this topic of VPP programs being stuck in pilot, well, if they are learning from each other, is there not an opportunity for a lot of these kind of state-based utilities to learn from, say, a pilot from a similar utility over in Utah, and that learning process through kind of osmosis might expedite the rollout of VPPs, so that say Oregon's or Portland's utility doesn't need to run its own pilot; it can just learn from the pilot run in the next state.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's what we all hope for, right? Is that it's going to be non-linear. Like if you see something like the Green Mountain Power example, like once there's like precedent that like, yeah, the Vermont regulator gave the green light for Green Mountain Power to use its capital. It's like, like regulatory capital to invest in batteries that go in customers' houses, and they needed to connect it all together with a DERM system, and they did that. Then that's going to like open up a sort of a domino effect where like everybody starts copying that in rapid fashion, and that's I think what we all are working toward. I guess I would say that there are some a little bit like VPP companies do this to themselves, right? Because like if you're like in a competitive situation and you're like, I don't know, just say you're a battery manufacturer and you want to go out and like prove to your investors that you're making progress in the market. One of the things you might do is go out and try to say, look, I've done all this work. I've got 15 pilots going on. And then, but are those pilots really like unique in the world, like advancing our knowledge, or are you just showing your investors that, you can like, if you buy enough steak dinners for utility people, they'll like humor you with a pilot, so I think that there's a challenge of like, for ourselves, like, are we doing something that's real, that's really advancing the cause, or are we just kind of going through the motions to make a semblance of progress, basically? But yeah, I think we all hope that that as what works becomes obvious, and there's lots of examples of this, right? Like with utility regulators in one context copying others and then advancing things. So that's what we hope is that all of these pilots, the ones that are really breaking through, will bear fruit, and that there'll be kind of a groundswell that occurs. Another lens of looking at this is like so we talked about the different like organizations in those color boxes previously. For the most part, those are all just people doing operations, but there's also these other sort of functions in the company. So there's operations, but then there's like longer range planning, right? So like if you take the Vermont example, again, like, well, if the regulator says okay, then when Vermont's going to like plan like its like suite of projects for the next 3 years and where they're going to do upgrades on their system, they're going to say, you know what, we're not going to spend as much as we've spent in the past. Instead, we're going to allocate that over here. to batteries in customers' homes. So that's that. If the planning doesn't occur, then whatever's going on in operations is not going to bring kind of reach its potential, right? And so then resource development is like those customer programs being rolled out, or the battery program, whatever it is. Those that also needs to be effective, or else the megawatts won't be there when it comes time to operate them, basically. So there's a cycle that needs to be in place, and that's not just different parts of the operations that may need to talk to each other to get the maximum value, but also that it needs to occur, throughout the different functions of utility. And then, where I spend a lot of my time is at this system level. So we talk about distributed energy resources, and that's kind of my focus. That's my title is just DERMS practice lead. So really on these light blue side of things, like how can we work with the utility to put in place the systems that are going to enable communication and information to flow back and forth, and potentially control signals to flow back and forth. So there's typically those market systems, which are for the merchant area. There's energy management system, which is like the balancing authority or some complex thing related to balancing authority. And then there's the distribution management system, which is what the grid operations uses. So how do we connect up inside the utility to all of these? There's sort of key areas where the virtual power plant resources can be used to create grid services value. And what we're seeing a lot of is that there's kind of a continuum from left to right, and so this is where I think there's a lot of it's as somebody's trying to build a virtual power plant. It's like you're thinking about like how can we, what is it that we can do well? What is it that we need the utility to do well, and how can we assist and enable each other? So whereas in that previous slide we had the DERMS system, and it talks about like the grid aware DERMS. There's kind of a continuum between on a couple of, a bunch of different levels, right? Like your utility, if we look at the front of meter and behind the meter, like utility's core competency is controlling, things that are connected directly to the distribution system. So if you connect a substation scale battery, or a substation's like a larger like solar farm or something like that, the utility can usually figure out pretty effectively how to control that. And so if there's 30 of these things, they're going to need some kind of system to control it. But that's really a system that can operate kind of within the utility network. Operators can sort of mind it. That's fairly easy for utility to do. But when we get on the other side of where there's like, in order to get the same number of megawatts, you don't need 30 units, you need 30,000 units. That's where the utility usually needs some help. And so they're going to outsource that to a software provider or a program resource implementer, or they may go out to like somebody who's saying, well, we're just going to manage the whole thing under FERC 2222. We're going to have our own VPP, and we're going to take care of this. So this is where on the right side of this diagram, where I think a lot of the VPP companies and entities are playing. And there's not, like I've drawn a dotted line in the middle, there's not like a hard boundary. This is really still emerging. But I think there's a continuum where, for example, to realize all of that value from the grid services at the grid operator level, like if you're just trying to, produce an extra 100 megawatts on a hot day to kind of when the price of power is high, it doesn't really matter where you're getting that power from. But if you're trying to alleviate a constraint on a certain substation because there's been kind of an outage, or because the utility in that planning cycle has decided not to upgrade that subsystem, but instead to rely on distributed energy resources, that's where you need to have really good data about where those distributed energy resources are on the system. And that can be a dynamic thing, because it basically, like, distributed energy resources can be connected to your house or to your business, but the grid operator, the distribution management system, they can change which substation is feeding that business, and then everything shifts. So finding the ability to basically talk back and forth between that cloud ecosystem on the right, of the utility network on the left, and all of the players that are behind the energy management system and the distribution management system. This is one of the kind of core, I think, challenges when we talk about enlarging that VPP pie, is how can we get the information over to the utility and sort of get the attention of the right people to look at it and incorporate it into their systems and their processes, and eventually to automate that incorporation so that when we present a virtual power plant resource, it can be used for the most valuable purpose, and that we can get then the most economic value out of it, which we can hopefully spread around to the right, between the provider and the consumer and the utility. There should be, it's easy to see, like on paper, like how this is a very good business proposition for everybody, but to realizing it requires that we be able to connect all the things together. So I think that's really the bulk of what I have shared. I'll be able to take a few questions with the time that's left. I think just in closing, I want to say that I do think that I don't think that there's a way to sort of short circuit this demonstration pilot process. I think it was just doing it more effectively and doing it less effectively. So we all want to figure out together is how we can do it more effectively, and how we can kind of begin to show scale, or the potential for scale, and connect that upwards into one or more of those grid services that reaches all the way into the utility kind of core operational systems and has an impact there, because that's really how we're going to create that market transformation that we're talking about in the Brattle report, or the liftoff report. Like it's just a question of like how effectively can we do this, which includes communicating across those different silos. It includes through the planning and operations cycle, and then it also includes the technology. How can we make connect the technology up and get the exchange data information in the right way, so that the utility has that information that they need, that's valuable to them, and that the VPP provider also has. So I'll stop there and see if I can take questions, or go back to any part if people have a few minutes want to do that.
Oliver, go for it.
And thanks very much. I really liked your sort of distinction between the two types of DERMS platforms, and I wanted to get a sense of, obviously there are a lot of utilities with very different levels of sophistication. For a utility that's sort of a simple, like say a rural co-op or a utility like that, I mean, those I imagine typically wouldn't have really a DERMS platform. And so what could you give a sense of the scale of effort and lift it would be to have a fresh utility like that kind of go from kind of almost zero to having a sophisticated DERMS that a VPP system could interact with? I know that's
Yeah, I
probably
mean, I think there's the utility like that might need a DERMS type system or something that fills that role. It's just not as complicated to put it into place, basically. So I think that there are different providers that kind of approach the industry from different angles, and there's certainly a couple of providers who have again, there's that 70-30, but there's a lot of innovation in the co-op and municipal utility space. In some ways, you talk to those folks, like there isn't any resistance. They're just like, oh, that would make a lot of sense if I didn't have to invest in infrastructure, then it'd be better for my customers, so I'd do it that way. And so there's a lot of there's fewer silos for these providers to work with. So it's kind of a different type of provider, and they organize themselves differently, but there are a couple of DERMS providers who are kind of focusing on that market and showing a lot of success with pilots and stuff like that. There's also the co-ops and munis are also don't have restrictions and are a lot more receptive to third parties. If you come in and say like, hey, I just want to, I'm just gonna, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna go out and sign up all your customers for smart thermostats, and then I'll build a program for you. The co-ops and munis are often very happy to go along with that.
Archie?
Hi. So I want to ask, like, what's the current framework that a utility uses? Is it mostly when it's trying to incentivize a consumer? Would it mostly be on the short-term power purchase or the long-term costs? I mean, the grid services, basically.
Mm-hmm. Where does the incentive come from? Is that what?
Yes.
Is that your
What's
question?
the basic framework they're using at the moment? Where do they see the most impact?
Yeah, I mean, most of it is like done on it's all mostly like especially demand response programs, but most things are an economic analysis is based on that bulk power. So they're saying like it's very much along the lines of what's like in the Brattle report, like okay, on the we have all of our investment in the utility is kind of like if you think about like a freeway or something like that, like why do we need 7 lanes of traffic each direction? Well, for rush hour. And so the same thing with the grid. We need, we invest a lot just so we can meet the needs on the busiest day, which might only be like 10 or 15 days a year. So they're looking at that and saying like, what are those marginal costs of meeting the need on the busiest 15 days of the year? And then they're saying like, if we were to decrement that need by 10 megawatts or 100 megawatts, how much lower would those costs be? So it's spread across all of the costs of the utility, but primarily they're just looking at where do we get the energy, the capacity to generate, and the energy from. They're not necessarily baking in all of those costs of upgrading the different parts of the distribution system.
Yep, thank you.
I think this is the right way of phrasing it, but earlier you were talking about how EVs are likely to be the largest number of DERs coming on board. Is that what you meant, or did you mean something
Yeah,
else?
I mean, if you look at the for example, if you kind of transport yourself forward 5 years and you look at like how many people are going to have a battery in their connected to their electrical panel in their house, and how big is that battery going to be, or how many utilities are going to have substation scale batteries, and how big are all those batteries going to be, and then you look at like what's the capacity in all the EVs that are going to be in people's garages, the capacity in the EVs is like order of magnitude larger than the capacity anywhere else. So relative to the amount of capacity that we're going to have in like just pure demand response, or even in some of these utility scale storage or something like that, EVs have the biggest potential. And so when you can connect a battery to a flexible load, then you get even more leverage, right? Like in that example of vehicle to home, like, well, yeah, I could, if I really wanted to, I could like reduce my energy usage this afternoon if it was a hot day and the utility is going to make it worth my while. But I could reduce my energy like many times more if I had a source of energy that was local to me. So combining those two things together is like a complete game changer if you look at just in terms of the amount of capacity that's available to VPPs. The big story is going to be in electric vehicles.
All right, we're at time. Adam, thanks so much. This was really great. Yeah, learned a ton.
Thank you. Yeah,
I know you shared your email. Is there anything that we can do to help you?
I just think if you are out talking to utilities and you're looking and you're trying to sort out those different silos, you're trying to figure out like, are we barking up the right tree or the wrong tree? Would love to have a conversation, and maybe perhaps I can help you, or perhaps I can help your utility partners help you, and we can all help each other that way.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Adam, and thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you. Take good care.